Human emotion changes matter. Human emotion influences the stuff our world is made of. It literally taps, it influences the stuff our world is made of in ways that sound superhuman. It sounds like something that a yogi studying in a monastery on a high mountaintop half a world away for a lifetime would be able to do. This is a technology. It is an internal technology that is available to every human if we choose to embrace it in our lives. We now know, science confirms, human emotion influences the field that connects all things and the stuff our world is made of. You know, a miracle is only a miracle until we understand the science underlying what's happening. Then it becomes a technology.
Western science has just arrived at the understanding that there is, in fact, a field of intelligent energy that connects everything, certainly in our world, and it's believed beyond our world, even the entire universe. Our science is only now arrived at the understanding through the experiments and through the studies and the modeling of the equations that tell us, in fact, that field exists. So this is the place where we are now, and it's the place where the ancient, the indigenous traditions have always begun. They have always started from the place that we are part of everything, that we are part of a greater existence, that everything is connected. And they have devoted their time, rather than trying to explore and prove to themselves this existence really is there, they devoted their times to understanding how to work within this existence. What does it mean to life and death? What does it mean to our time together in this world? If this field is really out there, can we communicate with it? And if we can, what is the language that it understands? Well, the understandings in terms of Western science that this intelligent field exists in late 1990s, early 2000s, is when the experiments actually confirmed what Max Planck in 1944 stated. The father of quantum physics, Max Planck, actually said that the matter that we see in our world doesn't exist. It says the stuff we're made out of doesn't even exist, and the world that we see doesn't exist the way we believe it does. What he said was, what we see as matter is here because of the existence of what he called a conscious and intelligent mind, and these are his precise words. And he followed that statement by saying that underlying this mind is the matrix of all matter, and this is the coin he termed in 1944. Of course, the movie series was based on the studies that came afterward, but it's actually been around since the mid-20th century. So this field, the matrix, or the divine matrix as it now is being called, is recognized as the field of intelligent, non-conventional energy. It doesn't work the way electricity or broadcast energy works. And perhaps that's one of the reasons it's taken so long for science to catch up with the fact that this was there, because our equipment isn't built to detect this kind of energy. On the one hand, the other hand, these ancient indigenous cultures, they detected it through the equipment of their bodies. They understood how to sense and feel and work and move in this field. So for me, I was trained as a scientist. And in my training, there was never an allowance for the possibility this field could exist. As a matter of fact, in the last 100 years, science has missed the mark twice in terms of their explanation, the story that science gives of how our world works. And we're now paying the price for where science got it wrong, essentially. And it's coming full circle, it's being corrected. But the first place that this happened was with the belief that the space between things is empty. And now we know that nothing could be further from the truth. There's a lot going on in what we always thought was empty space, but from the experiments that were performed in 1887, very famous Michelson-Morley experiments, to detect whether or not this field was there, when those experiments were interpreted as proving that the field wasn't there over 100 years ago. From that point forward, our science has been based in the belief that everything is separate from everything else. What happens in one place doesn't have any effect on anything else. And that what happens in this lifetime has nothing to do with any other lifetimes. And when we leave our bodies, there's nothing for our souls to travel into. This is going to be important as we talk about some of the implications of our time in history and where we're going. So this is the first principle where they got it wrong. And the second was that science, Western science, has believed firmly that the experiences that we have inside of our bodies, our thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, our prayers, our affirmations, in here have no effect on the world beyond our bodies. And now we know that these two assumptions are flat wrong. There is something in the nothing, and we do have the ability through our hearts, what is called coherent heart-based emotion, to create the fields in our bodies, the fields of our beliefs, of our thought, feelings, and emotions that extend beyond our bodies into the divine matrix. So when people ask, what is the divine matrix? The way to answer that, it is the container for the entire universe. As far as scientists understand right now, everything that happens in this universe and in the higher dimensions of this universe are all within the context of this field, number one. Number two, that the divine matrix is a bridge between our inner and our outer worlds. It's the conduit that allows our prayers and our good wishes for one another to move from our hearts into this field and be disseminated and distributed in the field in ways that we're only beginning to understand, in ways that appear to defy the laws of physics as we understand them today. And that's exciting. And number three, this field appears to be a mirror in that the quantum soup of all possibilities, if you will, that exists as this field will mirror back to us. It's like a large projection screen that's everywhere all the time. It will mirror back to us what we claim to be true in our heartfelt beliefs, not what we speak as our truth, rather what we truly feel is the reality of the way our lives work, our relationships, the way our worlds work. What we hold in our hearts is our truth. This field will mirror it back, and where this gets really interesting is sometimes those truths that we hold are unconscious truths, and we're not even aware of what it is that we truly believe. We know what we like to think we believe, but what we truly believe in our hearts sometimes is masked even to us. And it is through the wisdom of recognizing what the world brings to us in our everyday lives, our relationships, our abundance, our health, our romance or lack thereof, all of those things. Those are all mirrors, and the mirrors don't lie. They're mirrors in this divine matrix showing us our true beliefs, what we claim to be true of ourselves and the world, our limits and our capabilities. This field, the divine matrix, of the many ways that scientists now describe the field and what makes it so significant in our lives is the fact that number one, through this field, all matter appears to be connected. And the word that science is using for this connection now is called entanglement. What entanglement suggests is that when something happens in one place in this field, in the divine matrix, it can be in another room next to us, it can be halfway around the world, that the effects of that something can be felt almost everywhere simultaneously.
A new school of thought suggests that consciousness informs itself through its creations, through its art, music, books, and movies. With this idea in mind, when we look at the themes of some of the most popular movies of our time, what are those movies telling us about ourselves? If consciousness is informing us of something that we need to know about ourselves through the things that we create to remind ourselves of ourselves, what are those films telling us? Well, examples include hugely popular movies like The Matrix, for example, or Avatar, or the movie Inception. What are films like these saying to us? What part of our reality are they reminding us of? Well, if we look at the common themes, they'll give us a clue. As different as they are from one another, each of these movies is suggesting, number one, that there is a world that exists we simply cannot see from our limited perspective. But this world influences our everyday lives. Number two, we're told that we're limited in our lives only until we wake up to the parameters of this unseen world. Number three, they're telling us that everyone has the ability to do just that, to wake up and to transcend the limits of their lives that begin with the events in the world that we can't even see. The success of a recent movie, the 2017 movie Arrival, is another beautiful example of what I mean here. And it opens the door to precisely what I want to talk about in this episode. The theme of the arrival is so powerful maybe one of the most powerful, underrated, and perhaps hopeful messages seen in modern times. Because beyond the theme of the ETs and of the conflict and UFOs and the special effects, what the movie is saying to us is that there's a message, and the message is very, very simple. The message says that the language that we use in our everyday lives determines the way our brain connects the neurons, and in turn, the way that we think and even what we think about. I'm going to invite you to think about what I just said. This movie is suggesting somehow that the words that we use to communicate day in and day out, they're more than simply words, that they actually are directly linked to the neurons in our brain. Now, if you've ever thought about the power of just being able to speak, I'd like to share with you just how potent that ability is unto itself, and that will lead us into the power of the language itself. When we speak, when we say the words to convey what it is that we're thinking and feeling in our lives, what we're really doing is a series of steps that begins with one of the most intimate acts that we could ever imagine. We invite into the deepest recesses of our bodies the breath of life from the world beyond our bodies. We breathe in what is called the sacred breath. We breathe it into our bodies and we draw it deep into our diaphragm. And once that breath is in the diaphragm, we begin to massage that breath with our diaphragm, with the muscles in our diaphragm in a very precise way. We flutter the diaphragm just the right way to now direct the air back from where it just came, back through the passages, over the muscles in our throat that vibrate and undulate in just the right way at just the right time to create the acoustic vibrations that allow what we were thinking to be emitted from our body, from our mouth, back into the air around us as messages that become precisely that, the messages that are interpreted through the eardrums of the people that we're speaking with. Wow, when you think about that, what masters we are. What masters we are at the communication. But what our ancestors are telling us is that the language that we are using to convey that sacred acoustic vibration, that language is really where the action is. So the English language, as well as many others, is based upon principles of separation. And that separation is reflected in the ideas that it embraces. Separate and isolated thinking about things like you versus me, or them versus us. We think about winners and losers. This is the language of conflict and war. Language based in connection creates a very, very different kind of experience, different kind of thinking. A language based in connection is unity thinking. This is the language of evolution, of community, of cooperation. So the bottom line to what I'm saying to you here is that we change the language, we change the brain, or stated another way, change the language, change the way the brain accesses the matrix. Well, these ideas are central to the theme of The Arrival. And here's what I mean. A growing body of scientific evidence now suggests that we do not hold memory in the neurons in our bodies. We now know we have neurons in the heart as well as the brain. But what these discoveries are showing us is that those neurons are not what contain the memory. Rather, the neurons we can think of as antenna, biological antenna, soft antenna, that tune to the place in the field, in the matrix, where our memories actually reside. Now, this idea is more than just a metaphor, it's more than just a theory. What I'm saying to you is so real that engineers are actually now beginning to design the next generation of computer chips based precisely upon this idea. When engineers were working with futuristic technologies and were saying, where is our computer technology going to go? One of the things they discovered is that the silica that we've used in the past has limitations for the amount of information that can be stored on that silicon chip. So they began looking to nature. Where in nature can we find the material that could contain the vast amounts of information that we're now beginning to access. And they chose water. The new chips are actually based upon a single droplet of water. Now, this isn't tap water from the bathroom. It's highly refined, highly structured water compressed into a chip that interfaces with the machine, with the computer as we know it today. When the researchers began filling these chips with information, what happened was there was so much information that was being stored, they said this droplet of water cannot possibly store that amount of information. They were pumping tremendous amounts, libraries of information into this chip. And the mystery was, where's the information being stored? And they realized that the information was not confined to the droplet of water. The information was being held in a field that is linked to that droplet of water. The information was actually being held in a field that extended beyond the machine itself. I know this is a very different way of thinking, but this is how we learn. This is how science arrives at the new understandings that lead us to deeper understandings, perhaps the deepest truths of our existence. So the information doesn't live in our brains, it doesn't live in our hearts, it doesn't live in our cells. The information is stored in the world around us. And because of that, the way we access that information plays a very, very powerful role in our lives. So I'd like to share a story, and this is a true story, of precisely what the information I just shared with you means in our lives. I live in an artist community, a very creative community in northern New Mexico. A lot of artists, visual artists, sculptors, musicians, writers, all come together in the beauty of the high desert of northern New Mexico to create what they create. And it's always been that way. George O'Keeffe, for example, Ansel Adams made their home, D.H. Lawrence, they all made their homes in this part of the world because it supports this creative spirit. Well, one of the interesting things that I've seen in my community, and if you're an artist, you may have experienced this as well, is that a lot of times the artists have a hard time supporting themselves through their creations. So they end up with other jobs to make the income that allows them to create the things that they love. And the story I'm going to share with you is a story of precisely such an artist, but it relates to the way information is stored in the field and what it can mean to a creation. So I had a dear friend of mine, a musician, keyboard artist, who had just created one of the most awesomely beautiful, mystical, compelling, intriguing pieces of music that I had ever heard. And I said, wow, I can't wait until that becomes available. Well, to my musician friend, it wasn't ready for the world. He said, you know, I like what I've done. He said, but it's not quite ready for the world yet. He says, I'm going to take it in the studio and do some more work. So he would go into the studio, he'd spend all of his money honing and refining this masterful piece of work, and he'd run out of money. And then he would spend 6 months working in a restaurant or in a bar somewhere, saving enough money to go back into the studio so he could work and refine and hone this again and again and again. This went on for over a year. So I had an event, speaking event, in the Los Angeles area. My friend picked me up at the Los Angeles airport at LAX, and we got into the car and I turned on the radio. And when I turned on the radio, my friend's music was playing on the radio. Not the words to the song, but the music that he had been working on, that he'd been honing and refining for months. And he looked at me and he said, that's my song. And I said, well, that was your song. I said, the universe tapped you on the shoulder. The universe directed you with inspiration. You were given the gift of this song to share with the world, and you felt that the world wasn't quite ready, or maybe the music wasn't ready to share with the world yet. But once you anchored your creation in the field, it wasn't held in the cells of your brain or your heart. It's in the field around us. And what that means, it's available for anyone who is tuned into that place in the field. There are other creative people out there, creative people who are reaching deep within themselves to create something new, to create something, a new, higher expression of whatever it is. And it is their desire to create. It is them reaching within themselves to create that actually allows them access to the field where your music was living. So you didn't share your music with the universe, but the universe made sure that it was out there. And this was a very, very powerful lesson for my friend. I've had the same experience when it comes to book titles, for example. I've anchored very, very good titles for the books, and I said, I'm not ready to write that book yet. 2 months, 3 months later, somebody else, I look on Amazon, and there is that book title, that exact book title, and even the same subtitle that I never shared with anyone. How did that happen? It's in the field. And the reason I'm sharing this with you right now, and I want to speak directly to you, is because each of you have a creative impulse, and when the universe gives you the gift of a creation and taps you on the shoulder and says, here is something to share with the world, that inspiration means the world is ready for your creation in that moment. And I'm going to invite you, please share your gifts with the world, because we need what you're creating. You never know how your creation is going to influence or impact someone in this world when you share it with them. But the fact that you have that inspiration tells me that the world is ready for whatever it is you've created. So please share your creations with the world. Well, scientists are no longer asking the question, are we connected? The field tells us that we are. Now, the question is, how deeply are we connected? How much influence do we really have in the world through this field? Well, there are 2 very futuristic scientific experiments that take us light years beyond anything that we've believed and science has accepted in the past. I want to share those with you. What they are showing, however, has opened the door to a possibility that modern science is now struggling with. So let's take a look at these 2 experiments. The first one was published in the Russian Bulletin of the Lebedev Physics Institute in 1992. And the experiment begins with something seemingly very innocent, a glass vessel, a vase, where all of the air has been completely drawn out of this vessel to create what we call a vacuum. So a vacuum implies that this vessel is empty, but we know it's not completely empty because there are still little photons of light that remain in this vessel. Scientists know this. So the question now is, where are those photons? They want to get a baseline and see where the photons are right now. So the first part of this experiment, they draw the air out of the vessel, and then they measure where these photons are in the vessel. Are they all piled up on the bottom, or are they floating around the inside, or are they all stuck to the edges? And what they found was no surprise. The vessel showed that these photons are completely random. They're completely random. By the way, these are the same kinds of photons, the particles of matter that make up the atom itself, that we described in the last episode. So we're dealing with these fundamental particles of the stuff that our world is made of, and that's important. So the scientists found that the distribution of the photons in this vessel was completely random. No surprise, that's what they expected. The next piece of this experiment is where, while the experiment is fascinating, what I find really fascinating is the thinking of the scientists that made the experiment possible. For a scientist trained in the scientific method, based upon all of those false assumptions that we saw earlier in this program, those assumptions of separation, for the scientists to move out of that box of thinking and begin asking new questions like, what if our assumptions are wrong? What would that tell us about our world? That's where it gets really interesting, and that's what the next part of this experiment is all about. Because what the scientists did was, into the vessel that had completely random photons, they put human DNA. Human DNA, because they wanted to see if human DNA has an effect on the photons. And before I go any further, I'm going to invite you to think about what they're asking. Photons are the stuff this world is made of. DNA is the stuff we're made of. And they're asking, scientists are asking in the laboratory, does the stuff we're made of have an effect on the stuff our world is made of? This is where it starts to sound like science fiction, or at least something that an advanced yogi would be working with. But these are in a bona fide scientific laboratory, these questions, this is where they're being asked. So here's what they did. They took human DNA and they placed it inside the vessel. And then they measured the DNA again to see what would happen. And they measured the photons again to see what would happen. And the results of this experiment changed the way we have been conditioned to think about ourselves and the world. Because the photons went from being completely random when they were first measured, and in the presence of the human DNA, the photons are no longer random, they are ordered. They followed precisely the geometry of the DNA. The DNA was having a direct effect on the photons. The stuff we're made of is having a direct effect on the stuff our world is made of. Just like some of our most ancient and cherished indigenous and spiritual traditions have always told us that we are connected to the world. So this is the first experiment. Human DNA has a measurable effect on the stuff our world is made of. Now I want you to see the way the scientists responded to this. So I'm going to read this to you directly. In the journal Nanobiology, and this was published in 1995, the way the scientists described this, they said that the photons were described as behaving, and this is a quote, surprisingly and counterintuitively. Counterintuitively. It's counterintuitive because the scientific thinking is that everything is separate from everything else, and there is no stuff to convey any effect from the DNA to the matter. That's why it's counterintuitive to the science. But the next piece is what I find particularly interesting. I'm going to invite you to listen to the language. It says we are forced to accept the possibility. They're saying that they are forced. They're not saying it looks like or it appears or this is what we found. They're saying we are forced to accept the possibility that some new field of energy is being excited by the DNA. Well, I think we know it's not a new field. It's a field that's been around a long time. It's simply that we are just now recognizing that field and what it means to us. So the summary of this second experiment is that science now confirms that human DNA influences the stuff our world is made of through the photons by communicating directly through the field. That's a big piece. But now let me go to the second experiment. This experiment was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 1994. It begins with human DNA once again, and this is a very precise kind of human DNA. It comes from umbilical cords of newborns because that DNA is what's called very pristine DNA. It hasn't been eroded over time, as happens as we mature in life. So it's a very pristine kind of DNA. And the DNA is isolated in one vessel, and that is encased in another vessel to make sure that there are no other influences that are happening from outside to influence the DNA. So here is the experiment. This very unique DNA is now placed within the range of the field of a human heart that we described in an earlier episode. Every human heart, if you recall, has a field of energy that extends beyond the physical heart for a distance between 5 to 8 feet. And that field, it is an electrical and a magnetic field that we can measure with conventional equipment. So the question is, through that field, is the DNA influenced by the emotions of another person? Can our emotions actually influence the DNA in our bodies? Before I tell you the experiment, let me just share a little bit about why this is important. Human DNA, when it is in our cells, it is coiled in very specific kinds of ways. And what scientists have found is that in the presence of certain emotions that we would call negative emotions, and I don't really like to use that term, but I'm going to use it to be clear on what we're talking about. So when we talk about emotions, for example, of anger or hate or jealousy or rage or frustration, those that we would typically consider as negative emotions, they have an effect on the DNA within our bodies. And the effect is that in the presence of those emotions, the DNA is actually, the coil is tightened. It's tightened like a little knot. And that's important because when it is tightened in this way, the DNA does not express to its fullest capacity. So the negative emotions tighten the coil and prevent the DNA from expressing the fullest capacity of whatever it is that it is expressing, whether it's our immune response or our anti-aging hormones or whatever it is. The DNA simply cannot do its full complement of what it's designed to do. So from this description, you can probably imagine what the positive emotions do. Positive emotions actually loosen the DNA. They relax the DNA. So these are the emotions of compassion, gratitude, appreciation, for example. Those kinds of emotions actually relax the DNA within our bodies and allow that fullest expression. Knowing this, the scientists wanted to see what effect human emotion from one person would have upon DNA that's not in that person's body, but it's in this special container that was designed. So that's the experiment. Here's what they found. The human DNA was isolated, and in the presence of the positive emotions, in the presence of the gratitude, appreciation, love, and compassion, what happened was the DNA actually began to relax, and it relaxed so much that it began to unwind itself. The two coils began to unwind as if the DNA was about to replicate itself and produce a new strand of DNA in the presence of positive emotion. All that was happening was gratitude, appreciation, care, compassion, and the DNA was responding in such a positive manner that the DNA acted, again, as if it was about to reproduce itself in a new, vitalized, healed state. So this is something that scientists were not expecting. So now we've seen the results of these two experiments. In the presence of the positive emotion, the DNA is relaxed. In the presence of negative emotions, such as anger, hate, jealousy, rage, the DNA was tightened like a little knot. It coiled up very, very tightly. And this is telling the scientists something that we've never seen demonstrated under laboratory conditions before. Anecdotally, it may have been suspected, but this is the first time in a laboratory environment that we could actually see human emotion intentionally created by those trained to create very specific kinds and very specific qualities of emotion. The human emotion changed the shape of the DNA. It changed the ability of the DNA to fully express the full complement of what it is, whatever that DNA is expressing. So I'm going to share with you now directly. I want you to hear from the scientists. Quote, individuals trained in feelings of deep love and appreciation were able to intentionally change the shape of the DNA in their bodies. And they went on to say that human emotion produces effects which defy conventional laws of physics. Now, what are those results saying to us? It's saying that when we embrace the deepest truth, the power that is available to us, when we tap the fullest potential that we have available to us, that we are not bound by the conventional laws of physics, at least as we have known those laws in the past. Maybe the laws of physics are going to change, but the fact that we have the ability to feel a certain way, to create a certain emotion in our body and literally change the DNA within us, and in the case of the experiment that was not even part of us, that tells a new story. And here's what this story is all about. So I'm going to invite you now, think about these two experiments. First experiment, human emotion changes the shape of the DNA, and you saw that. The second experiment is that DNA changes physical matter. The DNA influenced the photons that were in the vessel. If you take out the middle piece, human emotion changes DNA, DNA changes matter. If you take it out, the overlapping statements of DNA, what we find is this: human emotion changes matter. human emotion influences the stuff our world is made of. And as we learn to embrace the qualities of feeling and emotion that change the DNA in our bodies, not only does it influence the healing in our own bodies, as you'll see in future episodes, not only does it influence the DNA in additional ways, as you're going to see in future episodes, it literally taps, it influences the stuff our world is made of in ways that sound superhuman. It sounds like something that a yogi studying in a monastery on a high mountaintop half a world away for a lifetime would be able to do. But the beauty of these experiments is that we don't have to do that. We don't have to leave everything that we love and all the people and the experiences that live in a monastery on a mountaintop for a lifetime or two to embrace what these technologies are all about. And this is precisely what we are talking about. This is a technology. It is an internal technology that is available to every human if we choose to embrace it in our lives. So, what have we learned from these experiments? We now know, science confirms, human emotion influences the field that connects all things and the stuff our world is made of. When we study physics, traditional physics, one of the great mysteries of the physics as we know it today has to do with the outcome of yet another experiment. This experiment was first performed in 1909 at the turn of the 20th century. And at that time, scientists, they didn't know what to make of this experiment. Prior to 1909, physics was mechanistic. They're called Newtonian physics, classical physics. It was all about things bumping up against other things, electrons and atoms and neutrons. But the new physics that was developing at the time, through the theories that were being developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that physics said that there's something else that's happening, that on the level of things that are very small and the level of things that are very huge, in terms of galaxies and in terms of very, very small particles, there's another physics that's working, that's the quantum physics. And the experiment that I'm talking about was known as the very, very famous double slit experiment performed in 1909. And the mystery is because the result of the double slit experiment actually is determined by whether or not someone is watching the experiment. Okay? So let me say that again. Let me tell you how this experiment works. The double slit experiment, it begins as a beam of photons, and you see a common theme here. We're talking about photons. They are the elementary stuff that atoms are made of, the stuff our world is made of. You and I are made of photons. Our world is made of photons, so it's not surprising that they would be used a lot throughout these experiments. So in the double slit experiment, a beam of light, photons, particles of light, was fired from a device, and it was fired at a barrier, and the barrier had two slits on either side. And what scientists expected to see was that once the light hit the barrier, it would go through both of the slits, and we would be able to see the patterns that it was creating in a very expected way on the other side. Well, this is where the mystery comes in, because what scientists found is that when the light hit the barrier and it went through and it was being observed. Now, the observer could be another human, it could be a device watching it, but somehow the observation actually determined how those particles of light would behave. When no one and nothing was observing, the particles would behave in one way. When someone or a gadget was recording, the particles would behave in another way. And here's the difference. Under one set of circumstances, the particles remained particles. On another set of circumstances, the particles became waves. So now we're talking on a quantum level about the difference between the particles and waves. It's the same energy expressing in very, very different forms. Now this is going to be really important, because what we have just done is we've talked about the ability of humans to create the emotion that influences their DNA. It influences the stuff our world is made of. And now we're talking about the stuff our world is made of behaves differently. Sometimes it's a particle, sometimes it's a wave, depending on whether or not it's being observed. The implications for healing, the implications for prayer, the implications for remote healing within the context of these discoveries take on a whole new meaning. And if you think about this, we know scientifically that prayer has an effect. Many studies have been done, and the question was, how could a prayer in one person's living room for their loved one, their son or their daughter, their mother or father in a battlefield of Afghanistan, half a world away, how could the prayer have any influence on the other side of the planet? And yet it does. Statistically, what the studies were showing was that people fared better when they were ill or when they underwent a surgery. Those that had people praying for them fared better, recovered faster, had less trauma, less bleeding, less swelling, less bruising than those that did not. These are very, very well documented studies. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. The question is, why does it happen? How does it happen? That's what we're spending time on. Because we're going to take this now to the next level. We're going to take it even further than we have in the past, because it begins to tie in to what we have called miracles in the past. You know, a miracle is only a miracle until we understand the science underlying what's happening. Then it becomes a technology, and it's something that we all have available to us. Although the observer effect was first documented during the first double-slit experiments early in the 20th century, as happens so often with these very important experiments, this particular experiment was repeated later in the century using even better equipment with new ideas and new understandings. And I'd like to share with you precisely the exact language of what the scientists at the Weizmann Research Institute discovered when they repeated the double-slit experiment. In 1998, scientific headlines all over the world reported this experiment. And they read, and this is a quote, "Researchers at the Weizmann Institute of Science conducted a highly controlled experiment demonstrating how a beam of electrons, so these are quantum particles, a beam of electrons is affected by the act of being observed." But even beyond that, that observation effect, that was noted early in the century. But listen to this. Listen to the new portion of this discovery. The scientists said, quote, "The experiment revealed that the greater the amount of watching, the greater the observer's influence on what actually takes place," end of quote. And this was actually reported in the very prestigious journal Nature, February 26, 1998, volume 391, if you want to look it up for yourself. This experiment is telling us that not only are we intimately enmeshed with the world around us and with the world within us, but the more focus, the greater our focus, the greater the attention that we give, specifically something that is happening in our lives, the greater the effect. But I think this is interesting because we already knew this if we followed the principles in some of our most ancient, again, and cherished spiritual traditions. For example, in the sutra from the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, there is a statement that essentially summarizes what the Weizmann experience just told us. And that statement says, quote, "Reality exists only where the mind creates a focus." Reality exists only where the mind creates a focus. So the ancient Buddhist traditions, they didn't have the science, but they sure understood the principle, they understood the mechanism. Where we create this convergence of thought, feeling, and emotion, where we create that focus, that is us observing the world around us. And it is that experience and the fact that that experience has such a powerful effect in our lives that actually made Albert Einstein, it was making him crazy. This is the piece of the puzzle that Einstein was never able to solve. He began early in the 20th century with his theories of relativity, and he was always searching for a unified theory, a unified field theory. Here's what I mean by that. In a unified field theory, It's where a scientist like Albert Einstein creates a single story that incorporates all of the facets of nature and physics and mathematics into one coherent story of us, our universe, and our relationship to it. The unified field theory has been an elusive theory. It is yet to be discovered. Einstein and the world supported Einstein, thinking that this is the man. If anyone could do it, he could do it. Here's where Einstein got stuck. And he actually admitted this on his deathbed in the early 1950s. He got stuck because he did not like the idea that we are so intimately connected with our universe that we could have any influence whatsoever on the universe in one place with us being in another place. And as I mentioned earlier, he actually had a name. He called this spooky action at a distance. He called this spooky action at a distance because to him it was spooky. One of the things I find particularly fascinating is that although Einstein was working with the same mathematics and the same equations as his friends and colleagues, he came to the conclusion that we are separate from one another and that we are separate from the universe and that we can be observers in the universe. However, a dear friend and colleague of Albert Einstein's, a man that lived much longer than Einstein and had a tremendously powerful influence in quantum physics at Princeton University in our world today, was Professor John Wheeler. He passed away just a few years ago. So John Wheeler and Albert Einstein, they were friends, they were colleagues, looking at the same equations, the same math, drawing vastly different conclusions. So while Einstein believed that we're separate and have no effect, Wheeler said just the opposite. And I want to share with you John Wheeler's exact words, just so you can hear his process and his thinking and how passionate he was about this. John Wheeler said, we had this old idea that there is a universe out there somewhere. And here's man, he called the observer, safely protected from the universe by what he called a 6-inch slab of plate glass. Okay, so it's not really plate glass, but that is his way of saying that there is something between us and the universe out there. But he continues, he said, now we learn that to even observe an electron, we have to shatter that plate glass. Listen to what he said. He said, so the old word observer simply has to be crossed off the books. He said, there are no observers. We must put in the new word participator. No observers, only participators. So what does this mean? I'm going to just very, very quickly encapsulate this idea and why it's so powerful in our lives. Because what John Wheeler has just said to us tells us that we will never find the smallest particle of matter, no matter how many atoms and quantum particles that we smash into one another and break into a bajillion pieces looking for smaller and smaller pieces. And we will never find the edge of the universe, no matter how far we look to the edge of the cosmos and how technologically sophisticated our equipment is. And here's the reason why. What John Wheeler just said to us is that every place that we look into the universe, every place that we look into nature with the expectation that something is there for us to see, the expectation is the principle that will put something there for us to see. So no matter how far, no matter how deep, as long as we're looking, the act of looking is the act of creation that makes sure there will always be something there for us to see.